Hi, I'm Tony Northrup, and this is my overview of the newly announced Canon 5DS and 5DS-R. If you want to participate in the show, you can tweet with the hashtag TCLive, and Justin, our producer, will throw your comments up and might even see some of them and be able to answer questions. Now, the big news on this is 50 megapixels. Basically, what Canon did is they took the famous and fairly long in the tooth 5D Mark III and replaced the sensor. They upgraded it from 22 megapixel sensor up to a 50 megapixel sensor. This addresses the many people, including myself, who've been moving over to Nikon or the Sony a7R in order to get more detail, bigger images, sharper images. So I'm going to take a look at all the changes in the 5DS and the 5DS-R, their prices. I'm going to compare them to comparable cameras, but I also have a lot of kind of interesting data, new data that you haven't seen before, research that should explain exactly how much detail we're going to see in our final images, for example, whether our lenses are sharp enough, and how much of a difference that the anti-aliasing differences between the 5DS and the 5DS-R will show you and what you'll actually get for it. So first, just to give you an example of how much more detail 50 megapixels is compared to what the 22 megapixels in the 5D Mark III. You can see it ends up making a much bigger image. Now in real life, this doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be printing a bigger image, because nobody just prints at a fixed DPI as big as they can. No, what happens is you have to print an image that's 20 by 30, and the more pixels you have, the sharper the image. But it does kind of put it in perspective how many more pixels it is. It's more than twice as many pixels. It's a lot. It's going to produce images of a resolution of 8700 by 5800. So if you're making an 8 by 10 print, keeping in mind you have to crop off the sides, it's going to be 726 DPI, far more than the human eye can perceive. Even an 11 by 14 print would have plenty of room to crop down before printing, so you'd be at over 500 DPI. And you can finally now make 20 by 30 prints at 300 DPI. So a lot of people say, who needs all these pixels? And I, for one, do. I make a lot of prints that are 20 by 30. And in fact, for fine artwork, the type of stuff you show in galleries, you often go much larger than 20 by 30. And that has always required us to go to lower and lower DPIs. And people, you know, it's about the viewing distance too. That 300 DPI baseline kind of factors in how close people typically look at things and how close the human eye can perceive things. So 300 DPI shows you like almost a perfect sharpness no matter how close you can possibly get without using some sort of magnifier. Well, it's been okay for us to go to lower DPIs, especially for things like billboards where people are viewing it at a distance, but we will appreciate these extra details. And for those of us shooting wildlife, where we frequently need to crop, it's going to be so nice to be able to use a full frame camera, but be able to crop down to a 1.6x crop and still have the exact same number of pixels that we would get out of, say, a Canon 7D Mark II. One of the big concerns about more megapixels is storage. People say, oh my God, it's going to weigh my computer down, I'm going to need more memory cards, and there's all these other costs. So let's look at exactly how much that's going to cost you. Looking at Amazon.com, right now, a 5 terabyte external drive, USB 3, goes for $150. So we're looking at about $30 a terabyte at current market prices, though they're constantly dropping. So by the time the camera's out in June, they should be even cheaper. As far as your SD cards go, well, the DNGs for this, I expect them to be about 80 megabytes. When I import into Lightroom, I always convert to DNGs because the storage is a little more efficient. That means you'll be able to fit about 12,000 DNGs on a single terabyte of space, and 1,000 pictures will end up costing you about $2.40 to store. So not too bad, especially considering these cameras are going to cost you about $4,000. I don't think you're worried too much about $2 for 1,000 pictures. As far as the memory cards go, 128 megabyte memory card will store about 1,500 photos. SD cards cost you a little over $50 now. These are the cheap ones. $85 will get you a CF card. You can certainly spend more if you need a high performance card, if you want to shoot at that maximum 5 frames per second rate, but you don't have to. And if you're shooting still live or you're not holding that continuous shutter down, these cheap cards work just fine for us. So I don't think the memory cards will necessarily weigh down too much, and these prices are going to continue to fall. Now, I want to make some projections about the dynamic range and ISO scores that I expect this camera to get, because in the past, Canon has been pretty bad as far as ISO goes, and it's been noticeable. When we did our comparison of the D810 and the 5D Mark III, the image quality from the D810 was far, far better. We just saw less noise at any given ISO. The dynamic range allowed us to recover the shadows. For example, the shadows in a person with dark hair, you can recover them and kind of add a nice gleam in a portrait. And when you do that on a Canon, you end up introducing a bunch of noise. On the Nikon, it looks nice and clean. So these are important and practical numbers. Let's take a look at what we can expect from the 5DS. Now, I'm assuming that the 5DS and the 5DS-R will have a sensor that has similar technology to the 7D Mark II. And the 7D Mark II made a substantial jump from every other Canon sensor, a huge jump in technology. Canon finally caught up. So the ISO score is based on the surface area of the sensor because it's based around a single ISO. So to scale up the smaller surface area of the 7D Mark II sensor to a full frame size, you need to take the crop factor and square it and then multiply it. So this is the formula that I'm going to be using. Notice this equal sign is squiggly. That means it's approximate. It's an estimate. It's not even completely approximate. It's just my estimate. But I feel pretty confident in the estimate that I'll be kind of close. So this is my expectations for the DxO Mark. I expect an overall score of about 90, but I hate that overall score. I never suggest anybody look at the overall score. As far as I can tell, it's meaningless. Instead, you should look directly at the ISO score and the dynamic range score. You can completely disregard the color depth score. I put out a challenge to the world for somebody to show me actual pictures that demonstrate the importance of color depth differences between modern cameras, and nobody could actually do it. Nobody can show me a picture ruined by poor color depth taken with a modern camera, a raw image that is. So I expect the ISO score of the 5DS to be about 2700, and I expect the dynamic range to be right around 12 EV, and that dynamic range is exactly the same as the 7D Mark II. I don't expect it to be any different. Compare that to the D810, the closest current competitor from Nikon, and you see it still has a higher ISO, 2853. So we should expect images that are just a hair cleaner from the D810, but I don't think that difference would be noticeable. They're so close, you would never see the difference. The Nikon, I expect to continue to have a better dynamic range. The 7D Mark II didn't really make any improvements to the dynamic range. Let's also project the perceptual megapixels. This is how much detail you're actually going to be able to see once you attach a lens to the camera. This is important because people often think, oh, I have a 24 megapixel sensor, that means my pictures are 24 megapixels. Well, they're that size, but they don't have that much detail. If you were to attach a very blurry lens, imagine a pinhole camera, obviously you wouldn't be getting 24 megapixels of detail out of it. No lens is absolutely perfect. And when you capture that image on a digital sensor, you undergo an analog to digital conversion. The kind of blurry lines that the sensor passes on, that the lens passes on to the sensor, turn into blocks, little square blocks, and that's a less than perfect conversion. So some data is always lost. The method I'm going to be using for calculating the 5DS's image quality is again going to be based on the 70D, which has a 1.6x crop, and then scaling it up to full-size sensors. I did not use the 7D Mark II because DxO Mark, who I'm using as a source for this information, does not have those tests available yet. I also want to make a point. I can't simply take an APS-C sensor and scale it up to the size of a full-frame sensor and expect that megapixel count to hold. And that's because lenses are more perfect in the center and less perfect on the edges. And an APS-C lens or an APS-C sensor captures the middle part of it. So they're actually taking advantage of the sharpest part of the lens. The outside parts here are a little more blurry. So I'm modifying that kind of perfect formula by basically saying it's going to be 90% as sharp, expecting that the edges of the image will be a little over 10% more blurry. This is a wild estimate. I couldn't find any concrete mathematical numbers to figure this out, but I expect it to be as close as we can get anytime soon before we can actually test the camera. We'll have a full test coming as soon as we can get our hands on it. For the 5DS-R, I did some pretty extensive tests comparing cameras with anti-aliasing and without anti-aliasing filters, and we can see about a 22% improvement in sharpness. So I'm bringing that back into the equation to project how much detail we'll be getting out of the 5DS-R versus the 5DS, which does not have that. Here's a comparison of those two camera models. The 5DS, as I mentioned, still continues to have a low-pass filter, just as basically every single Canon camera does. This low-pass filter, it reduces the amount of moire, weird artifacts that you would see in your pictures. The 5DS-R, I don't know exactly what this means, but Canon says it has a low-pass filter cancellation. So it's not that they took off the filter, they put on something extra to cancel it out. I don't know exactly how it works, but for the basis of the mathematical projections I'm making, I'm going to assume that it behaves like not having an anti-aliasing filter. So before we go and look at these projections, I just want to look at a couple of real measurements from DxOMark, comparing a camera with an AA filter to a camera without an AA filter. The D800 on the left there with this incredibly sharp lens, the sharpest lens in the database, the Zysotis 85mm f1.4, produces images with 29 perceptual megapixels. That's from a 36 megapixel sensor. You can see the D800E, which dropped that AA filter, brings the perceptual megapixels up almost to the theoretical maximum, up to 35 perceptual megapixels. With a rather unsharp lens, the famously unsharp 24-120 from Nikon, the D800 produces images with only about 12 perceptual megapixels of detail. The D800E still makes a substantial jump up to 15 perceptual megapixels. So removing the AA filter definitely gives us more detail, though it also gives us some more artifacts. Personally, I find that those artifacts never show up in the real world. I've never had any problems with my D810, which lacks an AA filter. But you do see them when you take pictures of lab environments. And so that's kind of, I think, a big part of the concern is places that test it, like DP Review, will show strange artifacts, but I don't find that they show up in the real world. So with cheap cameras, you can expect about a 25% improvement going from having an AA filter, or cheap lenses, you'll see a 25% improvement going from having an AA filter to not having it. With really good quality lenses, we're getting more out of it without the AA filter, so you see a little bit smaller of a difference. I just settled on 22% improvement for the sake of my estimates. So the first estimates are around the Canon 24-105 f4 lens. This is one of my least favorite lenses in the world, but it's also one of the most common. This is the kit lens that for a long time came with the Canon full frame bodies, and it was never sharp. Instead, I recommend people get the Sigma 24-105 f4. On the 5D Mark III, the current camera, it produces images with about 15 perceptual megapixels of detail. On the 5DS, I expect it to jump up to about 22 megapixels of detail. So you can see 22 is still about the maximum amount of detail that a 5D Mark III could possibly extract with a perfect lens, but this is a very imperfect lens. I expect the 5DS-R to pull even more detail out of it, allowing you to get about 27 megapixels of detail. Now, 27 perceptual megapixels is substantially less than the 50 perceptual megapixels that you could theoretically get out of a 5DS-R, and that's kind of the point I want to make. You don't suddenly get 50 megapixels of sharpness. It depends entirely on the lens that you're using. So if you're jumping up to a 50 megapixel camera, I don't want to see the Canon 24-105 on there. You got to get some sharper glass for it. Here's a sharper lens, the Canon 24-70 f2.8. On the 5D Mark III, the detail jumps up to 18 perceptual megapixels. Based on my calculations, I think we're going to be able to see 32 megapixel images coming from this particular lens. And on the 5DS-R, we'll get even more detail, and we'll see closer to about 39 perceptual megapixels. So that's a huge jump from 18 perceptual megapixels to 39 perceptual megapixels, over twice the detail coming from the 5DS-R when you use an expensive and high-quality lens like that. One of my favorite lenses in the world, maybe my favorite lens, the Canon 70-200 f2.8 Mark II. With the 5D Mark III, we get 21 perceptual megapixels of detail, shockingly close to the maximum theoretical limit of 22 perceptual megapixels. On the 5DS, I expect that to improve and go up to about 32 perceptual megapixels. And on the 5DS-R, I think I'll be able to get 39 megapixels of detail when using my 70-200. If you're doing wildlife stuff, you got the big daddy of lenses. Oh, you know how important getting a ton of detail is? Well, the numbers are going to be pretty similar. On the 5D Mark III, we're seeing about 20 megapixels out of it, pretty close to the theoretical maximum. On the 5DS, we should be able to see about 32 megapixels, and with the 5DS-R, which is the one I'll be picking, by the way, we should be able to see about 39 perceptual megapixels. To show you the very best lens that DxOMark has tested, the Zysotis 85mm f1.4. Not that useful of a lens, by the way, a manual focus lens with extremely shallow depth of field. It's a very niche-y lens. Anyway, I think we'll be able to get very close to the upper theoretical limit of the 5DS-R, which would be 50 megapixels. I think we'll be able to get 47 perceptual megapixels of detail, which will allow you to make huge, gorgeous prints. That's so much more detail than most people are capturing. As we back up, you remember with the 5D Mark III, you're probably getting more like 13 or 15 megapixels with a lot of the common lenses. So a jump up to 47 megapixels of detail could be a threefold increase. So with cheap lenses going up to the 5DS, I expect to see about 47% more detail. And with good quality lenses, I think we'll be able to get about 85% more detail out of your existing lenses. I know a lot of people are going to ask, all this extra pixel density, it's going to increase the amount of noise, yes? So there are a couple of different ways to ask this question. And when people look at lab tests, when they go to DP review and they zoom in, quite frequently they look at a one-to-one pixel comparison. So they zoom in one-to-one on one camera and one-to-one on another camera. And so if you were to do that, you would definitely see more noise in each individual pixel. But that's not the way anybody views an image in the real world, because nobody takes a picture on two different cameras and says, well, I want to see individual pixels. No, instead you scale them to the same size prior to viewing. So when you scale a big image down, multiple pixels are blended together, whether digitally or physically, whether if you're making a print. And that means the amount of noise in each individual pixel is blended together. So let's look at some data around not the noise in individual pixels, but the total image noise. If you relate the ISO score to the pixel density of cameras in 2014, what we see is the vertical axis here shows you DxOMark's ISO score, with higher numbers being better, higher numbers producing cleaner images. As the pixel density increases, the horizontal axis here is pixel density, towards 70,000 pixels per square millimeter, we see that the ISO score drops way down by two full stops here, going from ISO 3200 to ISO 800. So if you first glance at this chart, you would immediately say there is a strong relationship between ISO and pixel density. But this might not be a causal relationship. Let's now relate sensor size and pixel density, another possible factor. So if you look at 2014 cameras and you just look at the size of their sensor, these are full frame cameras, these are APS-C cameras, and these are micro four thirds cameras, we also see a strong correlation. So what happens if we now factor out sensor size? If we scale all the sensors up so that they would be full frame, what we see now is not a diagonal line that would show a correlation, but a horizontal line that shows basically no correlation between pixel density and relative ISO. Now we do see some vertical movement here. Some cameras have lower ISO scores than others. Not all cameras are created exactly equal. But as you can see from the trending line, there is no particular correlation between pixel density and ISO score. So I do not expect the ISO score or the total visible image noise on the 5DS and the 5DS-R to be any worse than other full frame cameras. So does pixel density impact total image noise? No. Now I'll ask if Canon sensors are noisier. This chart shows basically every digital camera made since 2002 over there on the left, over through the end of 2014. And these trending lines show how different camera manufacturers have been performing over that period of time. Canon here is the blue line. You can see Nikon is the red line, Panasonic is this gray line. They started kind of late. And Sony started a little bit later too, down here in yellow. So Canon in blue started first and started way ahead of Nikon. You can see Nikon sensors used to be much, much noisier. Nikon just gradually improved until they passed Canon right about the beginning of 2009. They were equal there for a while, but then Nikon kept improving and improving, and Canon's curve was much, much flatter. Well, there's an exception to this poor Canon curve. Canon has been behind, but if you look at this one dot here, there's kind of a gray dot in front of it, but the blue dot there is the Canon 7D Mark II. So you can see all the other blue dots here are well below it, and then suddenly the 7D Mark II comes in and pops up with a much higher relative ISO score than any other Canon camera. And you'll notice it's also solidly mixed in with the Nikon and Sony and Panasonic sensors. So this is the reason that I say Canon has caught up with at least the ISO war. I think they're not ahead, but they're in the fold. They're no longer behind. And I can expect that Canon will use that same sensor technology on their full-frame 5DS and 5DS-R. So are Canon sensors noisier? Well, they have been, but not anymore, at least not looking just at the 7D Mark II. So that's kind of the exciting stuff. I do want to go over some other points. The AF system is basically unchanged, but I always liked the AF system in the 5D Mark III. In our test, it was a hair off of the D810's autofocus system, but it was close enough that it never really mattered to us. This is an image just showing the sensors, the individual focus points, same as it always has been, and just another image showing it. I also want to talk about a new feature that's been introduced specifically to kind of take out some other factors that might reduce the sharpness of your images, the mirror vibration control. Now, a little bit of history. If you think back to the Sony a7R, this was the first camera with a big 36 megapixel sensor, the first full frame camera. And it had a real problem because people found they were having a really hard time getting 36 megapixel detail out of it because that shutter kept flipping up with such force that the whole camera would shake a little bit, thereby reducing the detail of it. So it's something that Nikon did their best to address when they released the 36 megapixel D810. DSLRs also have a big mirror, which flaps around, shakes the camera even more than the shutter on a mirrorless camera does. So the D810 introduced a system to dampen that vibration, reducing the vibration in the camera that would lower your effective resolution. And Canon has done something very similar. It's good. It's good. They've also physically strengthened the camera, putting in just tougher metals on the tripod mount. So when you do have it mounted to a tripod, there should simply be less vibration. That won't make any difference unless you have it on a tripod. But if you really are trying to get the most out of those 50 megapixels, you're going to have it on a tripod. You're going to have a delayed shutter so your finger doesn't shake it. You're going to have to kind of go through more work besides just using good glass. The camera has 5 frames per second, and I have not heard any mention from Canon that the rate will be better when using one of the crop factors that we'll discuss in a little bit. Now, they alluded to the fact that with JPEGs, you'd be able to shoot, I think, 500 images without taking your finger off of the shutter. But they did not mention how many pictures you'd be able to burst if you were shooting RAW files. So that makes me think that it's not going to be a great number. You might, I think with my 5D Mark III, I typically get with a fast memory card about 33 to 36 RAW pictures before the buffer fills up. And that's a realistic problem, especially when you're shooting, say, there's a bald eagle coming at you. You want to get as many pictures as possible so that you can get it timed with the wings up in just the perfect position and the head position just right. So you just take as many pictures as you can. And with 36 pictures at 5 frames a second, you will run out of pictures before the bird is kind of in optimal position. So you have to kind of manage that buffer. I think the buffer is going to be worse on the 5DS and the 5DS-R, but I don't know for sure. We'll address that when the real world test begins. Like the D810, they're offering 2 crops, a 1.3x crop and a 1.6x crop. This is just taking the center part of the sensor, thereby reducing your megapixel count. Essentially, if you use the 1.6x crop, you'll be taking pictures exactly like you would be on a 7D Mark II, except you'd have the benefit of being able to see a wider angle of view through the viewfinder. So what that means for wildlife photographers is you wouldn't have to capture 50 megapixel stills. You'd be able to capture just the 19 megapixel center of it. But if you've used a big telephoto lens like an 800 millimeter lens, you have this like tunnel vision that makes it very hard to find your subject sometimes. It's much easier to find your subject when looking through a 400 millimeter lens than it is looking through an 800 millimeter lens because you have more perspective. You can see around the subject more. So as a wildlife photographer, this is going to be meaningful to me. I'll be able to have a full frame angle of view, but still get the exact same detail that I would when shooting with my 7D Mark II because of the high pixel density. So I'm actually really excited about that. The D810, however, if I shoot in a 1.6x crop, it can go up to 7 frames a second. Canon didn't mention that you're going to be able to shoot higher frames a second. So I think we're still going to be limited to just 5 frames a second. They've created a kind of novel masking feature in the viewfinder to show you the exact part of the frame that you'll be, they're masking off the part of the frame that the sensor's not going to be capturing when you have it in crop mode. I don't know that I'm actually going to see myself using the crop mode a lot. Even for birds in flight, often you end up clipping the wing outside the frame a little bit, so I think I'd actually rather just go ahead and capture the full 50 megapixels and then crop in post. But maybe some people want it. Canon's finally getting around to offering some really basic software features in the 5DS and the 5DS-R. They have a new time-lapse mode, which we saw in the 7D Mark II. Basically, you can make little time-lapse movies. If you've been using Magic Lantern, hacking your old Canons, you've got this kind of capability anyway, intervalometer type capabilities, or you could have just used a remote shutter release. It will actually stitch them together into a movie, but for me, that's the kind of thing I prefer to do in post anyway. They're also adding a quick control screen, which just is like a simplified user interface that should allow you to access commonly used functions fairly quickly. They have a new feature called white priority. What this does is basically just improve the white balance. It should, they didn't go into a lot of detail about it, but what I expect is that it's looking at the brightest parts of the image and calling those white. And that's a pretty effective way for simply manually setting your white balance. So an alternative, but hopefully more accurate method for white balance. If you shoot RAW like me, probably not a big deal because you can always change it in post, but it does improve your workflow, reduces the amount of time you spend having to fix stuff if the white balance can be detected accurately at the time of taking the picture. They've upgraded the USB from USB 2 to USB 3. Thank goodness, because sometimes we like to tether, and even USB 2 on a 22 megapixel sensor was kind of unusable. It's too slow for real production work. USB 3 will allow that data to move along faster, so whether you're unloading your camera or tethering it in the studio, it'll happen much quicker and be more usable. So a question I had was, why did Canon not call this the 5D Mark IV? And here's my theory. First, they've done almost nothing to it except swap out the sensor. And I think if they called it the 5D Mark IV, we all would have been disappointed because we're expecting something more from that camera. They're still planning to sell the 5D Mark III. So they wanted to, I think with a name, indicate that this was not a replacement. And finally, I know in some Asian countries, the number 4 is considered bad luck. So maybe they will never release the 5D Mark IV. Maybe they'll just skip it and jump right to the 5D Mark V or go with an entirely new naming convention. The camera is not going to be available for about 4 months. So that's really early to announce a camera. Typically, camera manufacturers announce something just 2, 3, maybe 4 weeks ahead of time. But 4 months is way, way in advance. So why would Canon do that? Why are they teasing us? They're not even accepting pre-orders now. I think they're trying to stop people from switching to Nikon and Sony by saying, hold on, don't sell all your lenses yet. We're going to have a camera for you real soon. We're like working on it. In fact, I announced that I would switch to Nikon, and I have switched to Nikon for most of my production work where I don't need this wonderful Canon 70-200. I also think we're going to see announcements in the very near future from Sony and Nikon about 50 megapixel cameras. I think there might even be ahead. I think they might even get released before we see the 5DS. Canon probably knows that it's coming, and so they're proactively announcing this to seem like they were the first out of the gate. I want to do a quick comparison of the Nikon D810 to the Canon 5DS-R. You'll see I'm a little more interested in the 5DS-R than the 5DS, and I'll say it's because in my experience with cameras that don't have anti-aliasing filters, I've never had a problem. They just give me sharper pictures, and I'm really happy with them. So I know I won't be going into the 5DS, but rather the 5DS-R. The D810, even at current prices, is substantially cheaper, especially if you get it used. However, it has only 36 megapixels instead of 50 megapixels, and we do expect to see a substantial increase in detail from that better sensor. The 5DS-R has the 5D Mark III's autofocus system, which has more focus points, but in our tests, they were so similar that it was basically a draw, but the Nikon actually did focus a hair better. The D810, one advantage it has is f8 autofocus with more focus points, and for wildlife photography, that can be pretty important, especially with a full-frame camera. The 5D Mark III, 5DS, 5DS-R, and the 7D Mark II only really have f8 autofocus on the center autofocus point. The D810 also kind of wins the frame rate, but, well, not really. At full frame, they're both shooting just 5 frames a second, but you can crop the D810 and add a battery pack and get up to 7 frames a second. The D810 shoots 1080p 60 frames a second, and somehow the 5DS-R didn't upgrade the video capabilities at all. The D810, because it supports ISO 64, also offers better optimal image quality as far as the amount of noise in the image than the 5DS-R will be able to. At least that's my projection, unless Canon made a huge leap forward. The 5DS-R is still limited to ISO 100 at the minimum, meaning the D810, when you're in optimal lighting, if you're in a studio or working on a tripod or out in bright light, you'll be able to use the base ISO and gather more light and thus have cleaner images with the D810. Maybe not as much detail though. There is an existing 50 megapixel DSLR out there, the Pentax 645Z. It's medium format. It doesn't have a full 645 sensor, but it's still bigger than full frame 35 millimeters. So I thought I would compare it. It goes for about a little over $8,000 new. Weighs in at close to 3.5 pounds, whereas the 5DS, I expect it to be about 2.1 pounds. I think it'll weigh the same as the 5D Mark III. In every other way, the 5DS-R will beat the Pentax camera. There's probably the most important, better autofocus system, but way more lenses in the Canon world than in the Pentax world. Now, there are some who say that there's something mystical about bigger sensors, that medium format cameras just give you something kind of magical. And I've not found that in any sort of objective testing. I find that if you put the right lenses and you do your equivalency math by applying the crop factor to both the focal length and the aperture and the ISO, then you pretty much know what you're going to get, and there's no particular difference in the image quality. But I will say, like the D810, the 645Z will have better noise levels under optimal light than the Canon will, because the 645Z supports ISO 100. And that means it gathers almost the exact same amount of light as the D810 does at ISO 64. It has a bigger sensor. Here are some things that I'm disappointed with the Canon 5DS and 5DS-R. No 4K, right? We're all waiting for that 5D Mark IV with the 4K. They should put 4 in the name, like the GoPro 4 had 4K. No 4K. Canon makes some 4K cameras, but they're really expensive. The 5D Mark II revolutionized DSLR video, and since then, they've lost most of their market. I think most of us have switched away to things like Blackmagic, to Sony, to Panasonic. I know we have, and we've been much happier. We're still waiting for Canon to try to revitalize their video market. They're not doing it with this camera. They didn't even upgrade 1080p to 60 frames a second. That's something the D810 offers. That's something the D5500 offers, the D3300. All these much less expensive cameras offer 60 frames a second, and 60 frames a second is nice. It really is. Look up some 60 frames a second videos on YouTube. They look fantastic, much more fluid. There's still no touchscreen. And I always have some people saying pros don't want touchscreens, but I do. You just need to shoot a wedding or shoot those big group shots at a wedding. You need to go through and look at everybody's eyes and make sure everybody's eyes are sharp, zoomed in 1:1. And without a touchscreen, you end up using that stupid joystick and the zoom button and like panning around, and it takes you a while. When you do it with a touchscreen, you go like, you pull, you pan, you see everything much quicker. It gets you shooting again much faster. Another thing, all these cameras have this stupid 80s Casio LCD display on top. When are they going to update this? Why is this still acceptable that they put that ugly thing on top of the camera? How about an OLED display? How about, better yet, e-ink? Wouldn't take a lot of power, would look so much better, wouldn't even be that much more expensive. I'm tired of the 80s LCD display. It makes it look ghetto. Come on. 5 frames a second is still disappointing because with all that detail, I want to use it for sports and wildlife so I can just crop. But the 7D Mark II has the same pixel density. At 1.6x crop, I'll be getting the same amount of detail, but the 5D Mark II does 10 frames a second, and this camera does only 5. And with a still bird, it doesn't make a difference, but with a bird that's flying towards me, that's a huge difference. For sports, that extra 5 frames a second, twice the frame rate, makes a big difference. So I wish it had a higher frame rate. Really basic stuff, like no Wi-Fi. Like, I don't use Wi-Fi a lot, but it has its use. No GPS like the 6D has had forever. I don't know why they did such a minor update on it. No live view phase detect focusing, which would make the video focusing nice and smooth. That's a feature that the Canon 70D and the 7D Mark II have. And it's the only way to do any sort of changes in focus on video and not have it look just terrible. If you try refocusing on a 5D Mark III, it just looks awful. So you need like a focus puller and all these special tools to make it look decent, and they just didn't fix it. So that wraps it up. If you have any questions for me, add a comment down below and I'll try to get back to you. And please subscribe so that you see our upcoming real-world review of the 5DS and the 5DS-R. And by the way, share this with your friends, and if you want to see more free videos, click subscribe. If you want to learn about photography, actual photographic technique, check out my book, Stunning Digital Photography. I teach you important stuff like composition and lighting, because it's not all about megapixels and gear. You learn how to pose and make your model look natural on camera. Post-processing is important too. We all have to do it. Even if you don't want to edit your photos, you need some way to organize your photos so you can find them later. Lightroom is the best way to do that, and I have a book that's also a video training series that has 12 hours of video. So if you just want to watch the videos, you can get it here. Or if you want to read a book, better yet, do both. Go to sdp.io/store to get either of these books, or just check on Amazon. My photography buying guide is all about gear for you gear nuts, you tinkerers, you people who want to understand how everything works. It's a whole book, lenses, camera bodies, ISO details, exciting stuff. Okay, thanks a lot. Share with your friends. I'll see you later.